welcome to another episode of the Aetherica podcast, aka the Astral Garden. I am Sky Mathis, here with my co-host Ike Baker. How you doing, Ike?
Howdy.
All right, so this episode we're going to be covering and going into the mysteries. So I found this kind of cool book recently called The Origins of Freemasonry and the Knights Templar by John R. Bennett. And I haven't really read into it a whole lot. I just kind of poked around a little bit, and I had a really cool table of contents and all that. So it kind of inspired me to want to talk a little bit about some of these subject matters in this episode. And so I guess to start off, I kind of wanted to get your personal take on the origins of Freemasonry as you see it. And I don't know, perhaps it maybe has something to do with Syrian Adonisian mysteries as well, and the figure of Adonis. It's someone that I just recently discovered, so I'm not really sure. I just saw that mentioned in the book. But yeah, if there's anything that you know about Adonis and or the Adonisian mysteries, that would be awesome to talk about. But I guess first I'd like to get your take on maybe if you have any conclusions or leads on the origins of Freemasonry as you've come to conclude.
Leads. I wish. So I might not technically be the most well qualified person to speak on these things, just because I want to make an admission. I've only been a Master Mason for just over a year, but I spent almost 8 years now in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. I've been a Martinist in the Martinist Order of America for formerly MOOP. We had a split for a number of years as well. So you can kind of look at those organizations as, and I know it's crazy because from a mundane perspective, Freemasonry is esoteric, but from an esoteric perspective and occultist perspective, Freemasonry is not really explicitly, overtly esoteric. And that's kind of where the stumbling block is. Nobody can really point to where it comes from because nobody can really agree on what it is at its core. And a lot of Masons will likely disagree, but there are the orders, like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, like the Eleusinian, like Martinism, like the rectified rite of Villermoz, like Cagliostro's Memphis and Mithraism. They're all kind of these takes on what those people that founded those things thought Masonry really was, what it was supposed to be. So they were like reading this esoteric book that was Masonry, let's say, for as an analogy, and trying to figure out, well, what is this? I think I know what it is, or some hidden tradition gets handed down, or some intuition, some insight, that gets sort of, it has bearing out in the contemplations and perhaps spiritual work of a practitioner, and they decide they're going to go this way with it. Masonry has been very good as sort of like a seed ground for that kind of stuff, splinter orders. I consider things like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Martinism, Eleusinian, all that stuff. I consider it within the greater framework of Masonry. We're studying principally the same symbols. Now that, we want to be inclusive of the appendant bodies, right? It's not just Blue Lodge. but we're studying a lot of the same symbols in just a different context with a little bit more of a liberal interpretation, and I would say I use that term liberal not in any political context, but more so in freely, openly. So what is Masonry? Well, there are a couple of different interpretations. There's the mundane, and then there's the esoteric, and there is what Masonry explicitly claims itself to be. So the mundane perspective was kind of, I think the modern mundane perspective was really fleshed out in like the 1930s. I might be incorrect. Really, like one of the first things I read when I became an entered apprentice, really, right? There's 3 degrees in Masonry. When I took the first degree, I became an entered apprentice. I read The Builders by Joseph Fort Newton, and the lady's name, she was an academic in that time period, is escaping me now, unfortunately, but he references her work in tracing a historical lineage through Masonry from the Roman architects, the collegia, the Roman collegia. So if I'm remembering this correctly, I mean, it goes as far back as it can go. Just being in Egypt recently and seeing the grandeur of that place, the only, the most tangible, lasting things from which we extrapolate and extract so many details of their lives. It was in the buildings and on the walls and the hieroglyphics and in their monuments and the things that they said about themselves, the things that they built to commemorate themselves. And I like to say that they had the gumption to think that this stuff would be here forever, and so far they're correct. So the interesting thing is that these people, they required skilled tradesmen, not only in terms of understanding physics. Understanding things like trigonometry is tremendous in building. Understanding materials, understanding technology, right? Because that's what tools are. Tools are a form of technology. What technologies can we craft and create with what's around us using our mind, our ingenuity, to be able to build these things, and more importantly, how do we organize ourselves so that we can actually get this done? And that, to me, is the supreme secret of the builders. But they exerted a tremendous influence over the societies in which they helped to build, literally. And in ancient Egypt, they were given their own space within the, they had the Per Ankh, their own lodges, the House of Life. They had their own rituals. They were buried near the mummified near the pharaohs whose tombs they built. And that carried forth obviously into the Roman times, and they granted I guess the precursor of what would become the craft guilds. They called it the Roman Collegia, and essentially it was a college of adepts. Adept in their particular, right? Adept just means like skilled at a masterful level. That's all that word means. It has a lot of mystical connotation around it, thanks to people like Blavatsky who tossed that word out there like it was some kind of special candy that you only got after you finished your dinner, but they were adepts in their fields, their trades, and they were essentially in charge of organizing these building projects and creating more tradesmen, skilled craftsmen, journeymen that could accomplish these things, right? I mean, your emperor ain't shit if he doesn't have a huge palace, right? I mean, like, what is he going to be doing? Living in a hut? That doesn't really signal strength of political power, and beauty, right? These people could recreate a according to nature, natural principles, right? Because I don't care what you say, you know, it's very postmodern, it's very edgy to say, well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but we're not talking about the same thing when we say that. I'm talking about beauty as in the classical sense, ratio, proportion, harmony, symmetry. We derive these things from nature. The only thing we're ever doing when we're trying to paint something beautiful, I mean, we're deriving all of these proportions from nature because there is no other place to derive them from. There is no other place to quarry what is beautiful than what you observe around you in the physical universe. And it's things like that. Ratio, proportion, symmetry, which are all forms of harmony, harmonia. And you know, there was an old saying, I forget who exactly it was. It had to be some old English or German man. I put it in one of the Arcanum episodes, but he basically said, architecture is frozen music.
I think,
and back then it was.
Yeah, I think I heard that quoted by Goethe. I'm not sure if he was the original person that said that, but I think I have heard that quoted by Goethe.
Yeah,
or I've
probably
read that quoted by Goethe.
Probably, but so you have the collegia of architects in ancient Rome. And after a while, they were disbanded because they exercised too much power. They became too strong, unwieldy, in terms of the control by of the Republic. It could have had to do with the switch over to, you know, empire. I'm not really 100% sure on the exact details right now. I've read them. It's just, I can only fit so much in my brain. But it's in a book called The Builders by Joseph Fort Newton, and it's a classic for the more mundane Mason. And it's also, you know, you can, when you join organizations like Masonry, you could have these pie in the sky ideals, like you're gonna walk in, it's gonna be Eyes Wide Shut meets Boiler Room or something crazy like that. You know, I don't even know. You know, meets like Wolf of Wall Street. You have all these ideas of certain hierarchies and behind the scenes, guys behind the guys, and sometimes you can get there and it's a bunch of guys that you know, can barely put a dinner together, no less you know, control the government. But so it's really good to read things like the Mundane interpretations to keep your head on straight if you come into this from a very esoteric perspective. And so then you basically have the Lombardy Magistri Comasini, the Comasine masters, the Italian Lombardy architectural masters, and they kind of are considered to carry the vestiges of Roman architecture through, and these secrets and these you know, trade adepts are descended, let's say, from these ancient trade guilds. They kind of make their way through. And the thing is, like, trade guilds were important. Trade guilds did have initiations, you know, because you had to swear that you would keep these trade secrets. You can't just have anybody claiming to be right. When you become like a master builder, I mean, you have a totally different lifestyle. You know, you're eligible for more responsibility, and it can be very dangerous. Lots of money, lots of lives at stake. If you screw something up, you don't know what you're doing. And also, you know, they're privy to privileges. There's a lot of privilege that comes in any field where you become masterful. And so they didn't want just anybody claiming to be master builders, architects, and they didn't want anybody just claiming to you know, have these trade secrets and be eligible for wages and a certain lifestyle and the ability to move from town to town. That's what they call a journeyman. They move from town to town for work, and then they as a team. And then there's different stratifications of that team. There's the apprentices who, like, you know, they lay out the tools in the morning. There's the journeymen who in Masonry they're called fellows of the craft, and they're basically the laborers. And then you have the masters who essentially design everything and set everybody to work in their proper place and arbitrate right? They pay and they arbitrate disputes and they watch over the workmen. Workmen typically being, skilled with their hands, but blue collar people. So you got to make sure they don't get too rowdy. You have no mutinies on your hands or anything like that. It all has to be harmonious, right? That's a skill. For anybody that's ever been in charge or it's kind of helmed something with a group of people, it's extremely difficult. So you have the Magistri Commissini, who essentially are the descendants of the Roman collegia of architects, and they essentially, and Freemasonry kind of, to make a long story short, comes out of those rituals, comes out of those things. And then from there, what happens is you have, even in Masonry today, there's a distinction between operative and speculative. So what we do as Blue Lodge Masons is speculative Masonry. We don't do operative Masonry. I do operative Masonry because I work as a carpenter. But not everybody does operative Masonry. So our brand is speculative. And apparently they began opening up their doors to noblemen that had the time on their hands, that had the financial influence as these trade guilds started to suffer, and architecture essentially devolved into, slowly over time, what we have now, which is just a bunch of triangles. There's no consideration of design in a classical sense. It's all this very postmodern, utilitarian. Yeah, but what about beauty? What about natural beauty, rather than this kind of postmodern aesthetic that we consider to be, it's aesthetically relevant, doesn't mean that it's classically beautiful. Beauty is supposed to amplify the soul, because it's the soul's recognition of the patterns that are beyond. It's our connection to what Plato would call the realm of forms, the realm of ideals. It's our connection to that stuff. And historically, just in general, shapes and buildings, dwelling places, they've been very important to pre-modern people. Even in you read like Black Elk Speaks, I think he was a Lakota, and he talks about how the white man came and put us all in boxed homes, and we lost all our power. Our men became effeminate. They have no strength. There is no strength. We used to live in circles. Circles are the best. This is Black Elk speaking now, a shaman of the Lakota tribe. He's telling his son, who's translating to this journalist in the 1930s for him, and he's telling him, we had strength because strength is in the circle. It has no beginning, it has no end, and everything in nature tries to be circular. It has some aspect of it that is part of a circle, a cycle. And when we lived in the circle, the great circle of the nations, we were powerful, our men were strong, our women were strong, and now it's all gone to hell because they've put us in rectangles. Which it's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting, right? Because when you, as a magician or anything, when you create, the first step in creating a sacred space is to cast the magical circle. That's your circle of power. And even in Freemasonry, the compasses circumscribe us, right? Compasses make a circle. They make a perfect circle, and they're one of the chief emblems, and three great lights of Masonry. They opened up their doors to these noblemen who were very interested in things like liberal arts education and geometry, and wanted to learn all this stuff. And eventually it just kind of devolved into a completely speculative system, which we have today. Okay, that's the mundane interpretation. Very, very popular in the 1930s, when everybody was just sort of, trying to wash the stink of that 1920s, early 1900s, pre-war sort of spiritual syncretism, eclecticism, and occultism. It happens to be one of my favorite times in human history. But there was a push towards rationalism again, quote unquote. So then you have the more esoteric through line for Masonry, which is kind of propounded by a million different people to this day. Traditionally, it was Masons, you know, using their resources, using research, using what have you, to attempt to understand the esoteric secrets or esoteric side of Freemasonry. Now you have just anybody claiming that. It's like that Charlie Day meme that they have now. It's like non-Masons trying to explain to Masons what Masonry is about. You know, that whole like, oh, you don't have the 360th degree, so you don't know. You don't know. Well, how about this? You don't fucking know. And if you want to know, come join us. You know? That's the real thing. Even, you know. Anyway, before I lose my cool, you have now this massive kind of drowning white noise, just drowning everything out, competing for space within this kind of like political, socio-political, like town crier board, people just screaming from the rooftops about Masonry. Nobody really knows what it is. I mean, you know, least of all a lot of Masons, in my experience. But we'll get to, I'll elaborate that. I don't mean that as something derisive. I think that there is an underlying truth there that, like, we don't have to know. You know, we don't have to really be able to pinpoint this shit. If it works, use it. You know, all this intellectual speculation, it gets us nowhere. We're chasing our tails. We have it. It's right in front of, it's in our hands. You don't need to, you know, understand it in any other light. But the esoteric sort of exposition of this stuff basically is that, I mean, it all boils down to Freemasonry descending from ancient Egypt, you know, and beyond. It being passed down, you know, there's some verbiage in Masonic ritual which is not, it's written down, so it can be spoken about, quote unquote, you know, beyond the tiled confines of the lodge. So I can talk about it because it's written. You can buy it on Amazon in, you know, Duncan's Ritual Monitor or something like that. But there's some verbiage that says, you know, and thusly is transmitted through a succession of ages unimpaired, the sublime tenets of our great institution. And so, you know, supposedly the ravages of time destroy the physical monuments. It lays waste the Temple of Solomon. But Masonry continues. Masonry, notwithstanding, has survived. And that to me is the key, right? You got all these people talking about ancient Egyptian initiate priests. You got like Cagliostro and his Memphis Mizraim, right? Albert Pike, and his, you know, wacky syncretism, which he basically stole whole cloth from Eliphas Levi. All sorts of interpretations. I mean, even the guys from the Golden Dawn, right? They have a very Egyptian kind of thing going on there, the founders, and a lot of that had to do with that sort of archaeological boom in Egypt around that time, right? 1700s, 1800s. They thought that they had finally uncovered all these secrets. What they'd really uncovered is just a bunch more questions. So, but that's how it goes.
Yeah, it's definitely one of my pet peeves these days too. Kind of going back to what you're saying about like the, you know, the current modern application in regards to architecture and structures. It's like, it's just this annoyingly boxy, basic, cheap, temporary, fragile, lame architecture that we've come to adopt over time for the sake of most probably you know, financial, you know, just it being cheaper to produce buildings like this, but it's also comes with it not being something that lasts and within time. And so that's always been kind of like one of my gripes, just about like looking at these beautiful ancient structures that we find a lot in Europe, and nowadays it's just like we have these cubicle boxy office buildings. I'm just like, it drives me crazy. But
yeah, sorry, I mean, look at our lives, right? Look at our lives. Cheap, temporary, fragile. You know? It's like there's no concept of strength or lasting legacy, and the things that really contribute to lasting legacy. in a meaningful way beyond blind egotism and sort of this carrot on a stick ambition. And that's what Masonry attempts to inculcate. Now, the same way a carpenter square proves an angle, right? That's what we say in carpentry. The square proves the angle. It's telling me this is, 45 degrees, or 90 degrees. This is 90 degrees. This is a strong angle. This is strength right here. It's not this you can put, can bear weight. It can, you've got to get your level line. You've got to make sure everything is plumb. And those are the tools that you use to test the building and test its longevity and test its utility and its quality. And those are essentially symbols within Masonry that we use for less tangible laws of behavior, cosmic cause and effect. How do you talk about building a life on right principles? Well, you analogize it, and in the Platonic conception and in the ancient Egyptian conception, you only had, because of the vicious nature, the potential danger of materiality to the indwelling soul, that you risked dissolution on the level of the soul if you gave into the blind impulses of materiality. If the soul became so enmeshed in materiality, so identified with the body, it could dissolve. It could reach a state from which it did not return. And this is what we say in Masonry. We believe in the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and the hope of the immortality of the soul. We hope that we have immortality. And how do we go about gaining that immortality? Conduct, right conduct, to walk uprightly in our several stations before God and man, and that's essentially what Masonry itself says it is, right? So Masonry, you're told from the worshipful master in the East, right? Worshipful is an archaic English word, right? When it's an archaic word, worship does not mean this it never did. It adopted a connotation, kind of like when you just call a bandage a Band-Aid. Well, Band-Aid is a brand. That's not what that thing is, right? Band-Aid is a brand. It's not, but what you're putting on you is a bandage. So we have these words that completely lose all fucking meaning because people use them mindlessly and they can't be bothered to learn anything. So worship did not mean to grovel. Worship meant to honor, right? That's why they call the judge the right worshipful. It just means honorable. That's all it means. So when we say worshipful master, what we're saying is honorable master. And it's not a person, it's an office. And that office changes every single year. And every man in Masonry is eligible for that. To sit in that office and learn what it means to have honor and be a master and set the craft to work, give them proper instruction. Because you've put in the time. I mean, it takes typically 7 years to get there at least. So you've gone through all the other chairs in the lodge by that point. You've paid your dues quite literally and figuratively. But aside from digressing into obviously something I'm very passionate about, you're told by the worshipful master as an entered apprentice that Masonry is a beautiful system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. So that's what Masonry itself has to say about what it is. So here we have 3 different tacks. My theory is that it's all somewhere in between, right? Because that's typically where the truth lies.
Absolutely. And it's funny too with like the compass as a symbol. The compass it's one of my favorite symbols as a graphic designer, just a designer and a lover of art and geometry in general. I utilized it for my graphic design business years ago, and so it's funny because when I ask people if they know what a compass is, they typically have no idea, and they think that it's they think of the compass in terms of the directional compass, right? That northeast, southwest, and whatnot. And I'm like, this should be something that we're all familiar with. But yeah. And so I wanted
It's a geometer's tool, really, and a navigator's tool to be. And there's something that you're saying that is spot on too, because yeah, everybody should know what the compasses are, but there's also a pretty cool analogy in this idea of like a moral compass, right? That kind of there's overlap there in the symbolism.
And so I wondered if you knew anything about this Adonis figure and or Adonisianism, because this is something I just recently come across, and I don't know much about this figure or his mysteries or anything in regard to that. I don't know if you have come across any information or anything like that, so I wanted to ask you about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, this might come across as like a garbled mess because it's not my favorite myth. But first time I encountered Adonis was probably in the Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly Palmer Hall. Early on, I had only known of, like, saying somebody was an Adonis if they were in really good shape or something. That's cheesy, like 80s line. Or, but there's a couple of interesting things about when you examine Greek mythology. For instance, Adonis, right? That is cognate, right? It's a loan word from the Canaanite Adonai, meaning Lord, right? So right out of the gate, that tells you what? That tells you that the Greeks culled a lot of their mythology from surrounding cultures, and of course, they were a people, a seafaring people that had their economy, that had their the ground of their being in trade and commerce in the literal sense of interaction and exchange, and Greek ultimately, at the end of the day, ancient Greek was not a race, it was a language, and if anything, it was a structure in terms of like the polis, the city state. That's there wasn't a lot of interaction because of vast bodies of water in between the islands, and then the rest of the place is mountains that you can barely get up on a donkey or something like that, so they were isolated, but they did have a lot of foreign exchange overall. They were very curious people. They were not some of them were less xenophobic than others, and they were trained in Egypt, and they took all these myths and things like this. But Adonis, essentially, from my understanding of the myth, is kind of, again, relating to immortality, something underlying the physical that causes it to re-emerge, perhaps in different forms, but its underlying essence is still there, it's still alive. And I think Adonis is, I think Manly Palmer Hall in the Secret Teachings of All Ages, if I'm remembering this correctly, he kind of correlates the reason for us celebrating Christmas with an evergreen tree is because of the myth of Adonis. Apparently, once he dies, an evergreen tree grows out of his chest, or grows, his body kind of turns into this evergreen tree, and he's embodied there. I think his lover was Aphrodite or something like that, and and he was, I think he was immortal, right? He wasn't like a demigod or anything. I think he was slain because of some sort of altercation, some rival courter or something, like suitor. But yeah, so I mean, that's basically the broad strokes version of what I know about the myth of Adonis. But what's interesting to me as it pertains to Masonry, again, is this idea of the hope of the immortality of the soul. And you hit a certain degree where you are admonished to study geometry. And it's through things like geometry that we are able to, curiously trace nature through her winding and circuitous path. It's kind of like being able to see the fingerprint of the creative God. In Masonry, we'd call that the great architect of the universe. Being able to see their brush strokes, right, of the painter, the brush strokes of the painter, so to speak, a poetic analogy. but things like that, the and Plato would agree, right? Everything in existence is expressive of something that is eternal. It has a certain shape because of the underlying shape which exists in eternity as an idea. And we manifest on those things or around those things like scaffolding. And I mean, if you even look at, like, you know, basic, you know, chemistry, biochem, anything like that, the geometric shapes that these molecules form, you know, it's all based on this kind of underlying geometric pattern, which is, you know, basically a relation in space, right? Spatial location and relation, things like that. And so Masonry would claim that, like, look, you can begin to contemplate what is eternal if you study things like geometry, because they're going to show you the underlying patterns that no matter how many times things change or how many people, you know, if you die, if you live, if the sand castle of materiality continually is swept away by the tide, it will come back again on X, Y, and Z. It'll look like this. It'll have these shapes. It'll have these forms. There's nothing new under the sun. And it's because it's those underlying patterns that are the thing that's actually being expressed. And materiality is merely its vehicle for expression. And Masonry is the same thing. You know, Masonry is just an arc. It's a vessel for transmission and expression. You know, like that's the important thing to remember about Masonry. It's just a vehicle. It doesn't matter where it came from. Like any and all things can and will be superimposed upon it, because its language is symbolic, right? The teachings of Masonry are the symbols, and everything else is commentary. And what are symbols, right? I mean, geometrical, you know, figures. They're lines, they're curves. You know, they have color, they have form. They have proportion, they have ratio, they have beauty. Those are the real teachings of Masonry: allegory, symbol.
Absolutely. And in terms of Egyptian mysteries, are the Egyptian mysteries synonymous with Mithraic or Mithraism? Because I think I read that Zosimos, the alchemist, was somewhat associated with the rites of Mithras or Mithraic rites, but maybe that was just kind of like a side thing that he was doing. But yeah, maybe talk a little bit.
There's a couple of things. So the Egyptian mysteries, as we understand them, would have been ancient Egypt, and that would have predated Zosimos, right? He was alive during the I think the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. Right, that's the common era. That's even after, I think, the Ptolemaic dynasty might have just been falling, it would be Roman. That's Roman Egypt. After the Ptolemies, which were the Greeks who came after Alexander conquered and then died, and Ptolemaeus, after the war of Alexander's generals, he took over Egypt and installed his dynasty there. So it was ancient Egyptian, then Persian, really. That's how Alexander conquered. He conquered the Persians and by extension took Egypt. Egypt did not fight him. They welcomed him as he came in through the city because he was very respectful. And he honored their supreme god, the Apis bull, in Memphis, their capital. So by the time you're talking about Zosimos, you're talking about Roman Egypt. Right, that's totally different than the Egyptian mysteries as they would have been taking place in really late Middle Kingdom to the New Kingdom, really, to me, you know, or let's just say Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom Egypt. After that, there was a syncretism. I think the mysteries got better when it was Hellenized. And things like Neoplatonic theurgy and Gnosticism started. I think the mysteries, I mean, you look at the Temple of Dendera, the Temple to Hathor in Dendera. That's a Hellenized temple. That did not exist in ancient Egypt. But it's the most magical fucking place that I went to. You know, like it was otherworldly, unbelievable, compared to a lot of the other stuff. So that's not a value judgment. It's just not. It's not the Egyptian rites proper. And you also but he did exist during the Roman times, and so Mithraism was specifically Roman, right? It was open, I think, only to the Roman centurion, right? The guard, the only soldiers. It was a military organization. It was a I want to say clandestine, but it was an underground kind of secret, perhaps invitational body within the Roman military at the time, and that would have been consonant with the period in which Zosimos lived. But Zosimos, you also have to understand, he's associated with everything. He's associated with alchemy, Hermetism, Neoplatonism, theurgy, Gnosticism, because he was a great harmonizer of these things. Actually, I just spoke to Dr. Shannon Grimes. She wrote. She's the
Heard of her,
department head, of religious and ethical studies at Meredith College over in Raleigh. And she wrote an excellent book. I got it right here, Becoming Gold.
Awesome. Yes, I've seen that one.
Yeah, it's about the Zosimian corpus and sort of this cultural biography of the place. And she talks, she mentioned to me that she viewed him as a great harmonizer of everything. It was beautiful the way he took all those things and put them together. And I said, well, because it's all one thing. She disagreed. Obviously, she's a scholar, so she has a little bit more sense of nuance, whereas I'm not talking about it literally being the same thing, but they have the same ground. They're underscored by the same mystery, the same question, the same cosmogony, the same cosmology. When you strip aside the very minor cultural variations, it's the same thing. I'm definitely more of a Campbell Jung archetype monomyth type, because it's there. It's just wearing different clothes, so Zosimos may have had interaction or knowledge of the Mithraic rites, being a scribe priest. He was an Egyptian scribe priest in Egypt, but his special purview was the coloring of metals. That's really what his area of specialization was. Mithraism, it's another thing. Actually, the first time I read about it was in Secret Teachings. Manly Palmer Hall was great for that, man. Encyclopedic knowledge. Man traveled all over the world before he wrote that. But it's not like the internet. There wasn't like one place you could go. He went to China to learn about Chinese stuff. It's a totally different way of life. I respect the shit out of that. And it shows in his writing. It really shows his depth of understanding and the poetic license that is necessary when you're talking about spiritual things. Like, you can't talk about it in this dead scientific materialist paradigm is to reduce it. To reduce it to its only form. It's like taking a talisman, right? Talisman is charged with a certain energy. And just when you talk about things scientifically, you just pull all the fucking energy out. And it's like, well, now I have this piece of metal and this is what it is. Like, well, no, but you completely disempowered the energetic, spiritual, and symbolic reality.
Yes.
But Mithraism was kind of cool because it was around. It was kind of like people call it a competitor with early Christianity. I don't view it that way. There's something much larger at play, and I think that we'll get into that a little further down the line, because I feel like we're going to keep going with these little Mediterranean cults.
Yeah, maybe I wonder if, in terms of maybe at least the Egyptian mysteries, if you have any particular overview or little tidbits or notes on what they may have entailed, that kind of can illustrate just a general idea of what they encompassed. Maybe that would be cool to kind of describe a little bit.
Well, that has been a question for, like 5,000 years or something like that. Nobody really knows. but there are a lot of clues. I'll say this. So it changed, right? If you're talking about, so the ancient Greeks went to Egypt to be initiated, to study astronomy, to study geometry, right? In Porphyry's Life of Pythagoras, his biography of Pythagoras, he says that Pythagoras spent 22 years there studying these things. It's attested that Plato went there. It's attested that Thales, the father of logic, went there. It's attested that Solon, the lawgiver, was initiated and learned in Egyptian rites. And one of the reasons is because to the ancient Greeks, the Egyptians were already an ancient culture. So think about how much has just changed in your lifetime.
Yeah.
And then try and condense, like it's like a blip. It's like a blip. It's completely unnoticeable. It's like a wrinkle on a raisin. Like it's just the tiniest thing. And so when we talk about the Egyptian mysteries, they changed dynasties. They changed the location of their capitals. They changed their creator gods. It was Ptah in the beginning, then it was, Ra Atum in the Middle Kingdom. Things are constantly changing, as they should be. Otherwise, they're no longer living traditions, right? But what's underneath stays the same. And what we find is a nature religion, but not a nature religion that is, it's a magical nature religion, right? Heka. That's another Greek loan word, or it's an Egyptian loan word that the Greeks used, right? They come up with this idea of Hekate, the triple-faced god. Well, why is she the goddess of magic? Because her name is the Egyptian word for magic, Heka. But Heka was on the barge of Ra Atum, the boat, the solar bark that he sailed through the heavens at the day and in the underworld at night. Heka was one of the gods that was on this barge. And so that implies that Heka, magic, was one of the forces or natural elements at play in the creation and maintenance of the entire cosmos. So, because that's the entourage that would be on that boat. So they viewed things, and even the Egyptian word for god or goddess is netchir. It's essentially cognate etymologically with nature. And so you see over time, like, they're following the sun, they're following the moon, they're following the winds. They're gods. In order to symbolize their attributes, they anthropomorphize animals. I'm telling you something about that. Like, it's no coincidence that Horus, a falcon, has his eye plucked out. It's the most valuable thing to him, right? I mean, hawks are far-seeing. That's their thing. They can be like hundreds of feet in the air and see a mouse that you don't. So they're meant to convey things that are specific and somewhat naturally obvious, pertaining to these specific animals. Yeah. But what I can say is that, in my own personal estimation, from all of the research that I've done, from just talking with the Egyptologist who was our guide, we had two of them in Egypt, and just relentless, persistent study, it really seems that the stratification in particularly the late kingdom and in Hellenized Egypt, the stratification of the priest class, who really were the power. They were the power. They were the locus of actual authority and power in Egypt, regardless of the pharaoh. Right? They deposed Akhenaten, then they deposed his son Tutankhamun and renamed him Tutankhamun, because they didn't want anything to do with Aten. They wanted Amun to be the god again. He stripped the priest class of their power, moved their capital, and got rid of their pantheon of gods. And I think it was not just like this power play thing. I think it's like each priest was in charge of ministering to a particular god. Okay? If P, then Q. If each god was symbolic of a particular aspect of the natural magical cosmos, then that priest's purview would eventually become whatever is related to the working of that god. And that's why you have things like the Ebers Papyrus showing us, physician priests and dedicated to Sekhmet and herbalism. Make the crafting of early essential oils and liniments and things like that for mummification. Under Anubis, you have things like ancient metallurgy. That's Zosimos' purview, the alchemical hermetic path of dyeing metals, things like that, which essentially came out of sacred statuary, right? Because they would ensoul statues with the god. The statue would quote unquote come to life with the spirit of the god. The spirit of the god would live there, and they did this through a ceremony called the opening of the mouth. And not just that, but when the pharaoh died, they created a simulacrum of the pharaoh, and his ka, his etheric body, was supposed to inhabit that statue that resembled his physical likeness in his former life. And they would give it food and things like that to keep the ka alive in that statue. So it comes out of, like, there was nothing mundane that didn't have primarily a spiritual application or purpose. And so the stratification of the priest class essentially created these natural philosopher magicians. In my estimation, the Egyptian priest class were the first philosophers as we understand it. They were investigating nature. They were proto-scientists as we understand it. They were investigating, right? They discovered the underlying patterns inherent in all things. And that was their purview. It's kind of like nowadays modern alchemists see the Tria Prima at work under the four elements. Well, they were observing some species of that in everything. And that's why, in my estimation, you have the great philosophers, natural philosophers, geometers going to Egypt and coming back. These great men, right? They're not brilliant when they go there, but they come back and they're almost like superhuman in their knowledge. They changed the course of human history by bringing that light to their respective little corners of the world, the Mediterranean. So those are my thoughts really on, quote unquote Egyptian mysteries. There's a lot that has been written. Norman D. Ellis is one of my favorites. Believe it or not, Budge's work on Egyptian magic, I think, is really, really good. All, the funerary texts as a corpus, the Book of Gates, the Book of Hours, and the Book of Coming Forth by Day, or the Egyptian Book of that, it's all one book. It's like people make the mistake of thinking that they're separate funerary texts when it's all part of a larger corpus. It's the same way the Bible is 66 books. And if I die, I want, like, a line, a verse from Matthew on my tombstone. I can't fit the entire gospel, so it's I would recommend that you look there really for the mysteries, because they were about what happens to you when that exterior materiality that we're talking about dies and you continue onward. And that's essentially the mystery tradition is the rites of the immortality of the soul.
Yeah. Beautiful. All right, now, so Dionysian. First, I guess my question is, who was Bacchus, whom the Greeks referred to as Dionysius? Maybe, like, where did the name Bacchus originate from? And then second, like, kind of what are some of the details in regards to the Dionysian mysteries? Are those an evolution of the Egyptian in your estimation? Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that.
So Bacchus, I feel like Bacchus is more Latin, but I'm not really sure. So I don't really know if that predates the term Dionysus or Dionysus as it is anglicized. But I know that essentially Dionysus or Bacchus, they were gods of wine and revelry. So that's a definite that's a definite connotation. That's the definite purview, particularly of Dionysus, right? He was the god of the vine, and he was the god of divine inebriation. And what I have found interesting about Dionysus is the polarity with which he is and his overall mysteries are portrayed. So it's just like anything else, right? This is them using mythological terminology to talk about the mundane and the spiritual qualities of getting wasted. Because it's a fact, right? We look at everything like it's separate, when at the end of the day you cannot toggle. I can't take this side of this coin and move it over here.
Sweet coin, by the way.
And then I know, and then leave this part, this side of
Mark Stavish
over here. Right, exactly. It's a beautiful coin, Mark. Thank you very much. But you essentially, you cannot move one side of that coin without moving the other. And it's the same thing with materiality and spirituality. There is no material action that does not have a spiritual consequence, and vice versa. So they talked about this dual polarity of the I think they're called the Maenads, his sort of like entourage of female devotees who were given to just like these explosive bouts of wine-induced mania, and they were the ones who ripped Orpheus like to pieces. They ripped him to shreds, and they stuck his head on a pike, and it sang for eternity. You know, like, beautiful myth. But and then on the other hand, you have the divine revelation of inebriation, which I kind of correlate to the Platonic idea of mantia, right? We call the mantic arts, arts of divination, arts of intuition. What that word really means is madness. And Plato kind of delineates it as this divine ecstasy. Now, ecstasy is ekstasis, means standing outside of yourself, literally like an out-of-body experience or a separation from the mundane persona for a minute, right? And that's really what we're trying to create when we're divining. When we're searching for intuition, you have to shut your intellect off. You have to shut your persona down. You must put it in abeyance temporarily to allow space for that which is within you that remembers, right? Anamnesis in the Platonic corpus. The fog of Lethe lifts momentarily in the divine mantia of inebriation. And it's actually a higher rationale to Plato. It's a higher rationale than the intellective and rational faculties. And that, to me, is Dionysian, the divine ecstasy that gives you a momentary clarity amid the hallucination of material life.
Yeah. And I would say if anybody's interested in maybe that sort of thing, I've deferred to a couple different individuals. I'd say Brian, I think it's Brian Morozku or something like that. He wrote a book on that. And then P.D. Newman as well, if you want to explore those territories.
Yeah, man, he's great, dude. I talked to him quite a bit. I'm working my way through Angels in Vermilion. And it's really interesting. He has definitely swayed my perspective in some senses. I still think that there has to be. So the reason why entheogens were so effective as spiritual catalysts is because of the way in which they were handled. They were sort of sequestered. They were controlled, not by the state, but by the priests of the mysteries. We don't have that anymore. And it's very difficult for the uninitiated to self-initiate. It just becomes self-medicate at that point. And so if we could return to if we could return to a state of this kind of, administration under the auspices of spirituality via symbols and via the synthemata of rituals, and I guess a modicum of teaching or training while in that state and leading up to it, sure, that's great. But, I don't care what Terence McKenna says. You can't unleash psychedelics on the population and expect us not to go even further into hell. Yeah. It's just not possible.
For sure. I guess the last inquiry I have into this subject of the mysteries is along the lines of the Eleusinian and or Samothracian. So I read that Eleusis was an old priest of Samothrace, and you've mentioned Samothracian mysteries prior, but we didn't really touch on it too much. And I wonder, are Samothracian mysteries something of the same vein as Eleusinian mysteries? Because I would assume the Eleusinian mysteries have something to do with this Samothracian priest Eleusis, but yeah, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah. So Samothraki was a Greek island. I think it was over by Turkey, though. Not really sure, but I know it was Greek, so Greek speaking. Had intercourse with that seafaring culture, its peoples, as defined by the language and the structure of the polis, and they have a really cool set of mysteries that the Golden Dawn kind of co-opted for one of their rituals. Now you talk to a typical Golden Dawner and they'll know something of the Samothracian mysteries, but they, it's not, the tack I have on it is not necessarily typical of I think a more Golden Dawn exclusive perspective. But you essentially have like the great gods. I think it's like to megalotheon, the great gods being worshipped in Samothrace, and one of which is the Great Mother. Another is for all intents and purposes, Demeter. And then you have Hecate. Again, was another. I forget. She was worshipped under like a couple different forms, right? She is the triple-faced goddess, maiden, mother, crone type of thing. I forget which one of her aspects she was worshipped in. Could have been all of them, but and then you have this really interesting triad called Axiokersos, Axiokera, and Axiokersa and Axieros. This triad of gods, and in the Golden Dawn, they kind of interact with this candidate that's called Kasmilos. But I think the name of that fourth kind of player in there was Kadmilos. In the Samothracian mysteries. And I do, without getting too far into it, because not a tremendous amount is known about any of this stuff, but there is a direct correlation to this relationship of Demeter, the Great Mother, Persephone, whose name archaically, more originally was Kore, meaning the maiden, right, an attribute of Hecate, and Hades, or Pluton, the god of the underworld, and that was exactly, and I think Cadmilos was Hermes. So right there, that cast and crew of those mysteries, that's a 1-to-1 with the Eleusinian mysteries. Okay, all I know is that the town was called Eleusina. It's not Eleusis. You go to Greece trying to look for Eleusis, you can be chasing your tail for days like I did. It's Eleusina. The Upsilon is usually translated by academic anglicization to a U, I think by way of Latin, right? Because the Romans actually at a certain point sponsored those mysteries. Marcus Aurelius himself was initiated at Eleusina. But Greeks do not pronounce the Upsilon like a U. It's usually like an F. So it's or a Y, if anything. So It's Eleusina, and so that was my understanding of it. I don't know about who went where or did what, and how any of that stuff was transmitted. But the thing is, again, we're talking about symbols. We're talking about the outer garb of an underlying truth, and the best that we can do is talk about it in these terms, right? I mean, Plato talks about that in the Timaeus. Timaeus basically says, look, is there this big dude in the sky named the Demiurge that's, putting building blocks? No. Or I don't know, because I'm just a person and you guys are just people that are listening to me. But at the end of the day, if this is the best that we can do, then we should do it, right? If the best that we can do to talk about things that transcend words is to put them into symbolic form in which we can sort of understand them, then let's just do that and leave it be, instead of trying to. They didn't have this conception of like abstract quantum physics that we have. We look back and scoff at them, but the mythological terminology was their scientific vernacular. It was the same thing. So it's a different point in time. They didn't have the technology that allowed us to, they also didn't have, it wasn't really until Aristotle that they had this, left brain dissectional, categorize it, put it in this filing cabinet. They had no way of coming to those, those very fine-tuned quantifications, right? It was Aristotle who wrote about the categories and things like that. Quantification and quality. But the myth of Persephone to me really changed when I really understood it. The myths of Eleusis, the rites of Eleusis. I was there, and I did some vision work, actually, the first time I went. I went there twice. And actually I did vision work both times. The first time was kind of weird, but it was incredible. It's just incredible. It's just a field at this point with a bunch of stones, similar to most ancient ruins. But when I really understood it, it unlocked kind of this door of understanding of spiritual perception. And a lot of it is etymology. Or not a lot of it, some of it is etymology. And it clued me into the necessity of etymology in our studies. So Persephone in Greek means like the murderer, like the slayer. And you sit there and you scratch your head. You're like, well, how the hell, what does that have to do with anything? So I'll retell the myth briefly. Myths have all sorts of variations. I'll tell the variation that I like. So Persephone is Demeter's daughter, right? Demeter is the great mother, the great earth mother. She is the goddess of grain and the harvest, and really consequently the seasons, the cycle of birth, growth, decay, and death, right? Kind of like Isis. And her daughter is Persephone, the maiden, the virgin. So Persephone is out one day in the field collecting flowers, and she bends down, kind of not paying attention. This flower catches her eye. It's the most beautiful flower she's ever seen. She reaches down and she grasps hold of it, and it's the narcissus flower. Mm-hmm. And what happens is, as she's pulling on the narcissus flower, she's reaching downward. The ground opens up, and the horses of Hades come charging forth with the Lord of the underworld, the black brother of the Olympian triad. And he grabs her and abducts her and pulls her down into the underworld. Some say that she is raped. I don't really like that version. I like the version where she's just abducted, because what's really important comes later. So Demeter goes looking for her, and she's weeping and she's crying and searching all the land. And then finally she goes to Zeus, and she's like, I don't know where my daughter is. And Zeus finds out that from Poseidon, I think, that the sort of middle brother of the three, that Hades has abducted her, and she's now queen of the underworld. She is his queen, his prize. So Demeter says, listen, you've got to get her back. And Zeus says, look, he's in charge of what happens down there. I can't do anything. Those are the rules. That's the agreement we made. And so she says, well, for as long as Persephone remains in the underworld, I am going to weep, and no grain shall grow in the land. The seasons will stop. And so she begins to cry, and a winter comes upon the earth. Nothing grows, and the people are dying. And now what does that matter to Zeus, right? He don't eat. But what the gods live off of is worship and tribute, right? Those big thigh bones wrapped in fat. That's what they want. And so that stops happening because animals die. It's winter. People just stop sacrificing. So then he finally says to Hermes, right, who carries the caduceus staff. So he is able, by that implement given to him by Apollo, to traverse Olympus, the celestial realm, a quote unquote Middle Earth, the middle realm, and then the underworld. So he says to Hermes, go down and tell Hades that he's got to give her back. So Hermes goes down and he sees Hades with Persephone. He's like, listen, we've got a real problem. She's got to come back topside. And Hades kind of puts up a fight, but he says, look, Zeus sent me. And so he's got to listen to that. But what happens is that Persephone had been down there for so long that she had hardly eaten. And Hades knew this. And so his last bout of trickery was to offer her something to eat. And she refused. She kept refusing. And then he said, just something small. Have this pomegranate seed. And finally she relents. She's so hungry. She just eats the pomegranate seed. And she says, no more. That's all I'll accept from you. So when Hermes comes to arbitrate this deal and get her out of there, Hades says, listen, and this is right. This is classic Greek mythological logic. I'll let her go back up, but she has tasted of the fruit of my realm. She has eaten a pomegranate seed, and therefore she must return. At which point Persephone wails, but they take her back up topside. She's able to be with her mother. Grain grows again, right? The spring, the summer, the fall harvest, and then she's got to go back for a season every year, every cycle. And that's when winter happens. Now, you get a lot of really thick-headed people who talk about, well, it was just their way of explaining why the seasons change. I don't know. I tend not to think so. The people who, built the Parthenon and gave us philosophy and mathematics and things like that, I tend to think that as a population, they were a little better than that. But as was customary in all these traditions over all time, it's something highly symbolic. And when you understand the myth for what it is, it's mind-blowing. Persephone reaches down. Right. So we talked about the Samothracian mysteries. In the Golden Dawn, those are linked to something called the Chaldean oracles attributed to Zoroaster. In reality, that collection of documents is just sayings by Neoplatonists like Plotinus and Proclus and all that stuff. But one of the lines actually is, stoop not down into that darkly splendid world wherein lieth a continually faithless gloom, or something to that effect. Hades, wrapped in gloom, delighting in unintelligible images, ever espousing a body unluminous, formless, and void. Something to that effect. But stoop not down into that darkly splendid world. And she stoops down, and what does she reach for? The narcissus flower. The image of the self. Being lured into the underworld by an image of the self, a narcissistic kind of simulacrum. And she's pulled down, and she stays there, and she has a divine mother. The great mother weeps for her, right? Persephone is the soul that has descended into the underworld, which really in Greek mythology was the sublunary realm. The underworld was not like, the underworld was this. We live in the classical Greek underworld. The realm of Hades is the earth. That's really what it was meant to convey, materiality. And so Persephone reaches down, and we see this also in the Golden Dawn, in the diagram of the the fall from the tree of or from the Garden of Eden. Eve is on the bottom supporting Adam, and she reaches downward, leaving everything unsupported, and Adam and Eve both fall into materiality, right? The next step is that they're wearing animal skins. This is the animal skin. And that is the story of, right? Persephone is the bringer of death, the slayer, because embodied existence is a death to the soul, right? That's that whole Platonic conception of soma sema. Soma meaning body, sema meaning prison. The human form is the prison of the once far wandering soul, which we say in the Golden Dawn has been bound into a narrow place by the threefold material inclination. That's what all these traditions are trying to tell you about. It's a Gnostic tale. We're stuck here. We've got to get out. And the pomegranate seed is what lures us back. Tasting of the fruits of materiality, desire, predilection, taste, comfort, all these, even the attachments to the people that you love, right? Plato also says through Socrates, and I think the Phaedrus, you are just as enthralled to the illusion of materiality as when you are happy than as you are when you're sad. It's not just sadness that is a lie. It's the happiness, because you're investing in the illusion. And those investments over time are believed to imbue the soul with desire. And that desire, that attachment, this is Buddhist. This is Vedantic. This is straight out of Plotinus in the Neoplatonic philosophy, who was taught by Ammonius Saccas, the Scythian sage. The attachments pull us back down into the cycle of reincarnation, and we cannot ascend. That's the cycle. She has tasted of the fruits of the underworld, and so she keeps going back. That's the story of the soul, and that was the Eleusinian mysteries.
Yeah, man, I wish I had the self-control to only taste just one pomegranate seed and call it good. I love me some pomegranate.
I mean, look at this right here. Look at this right here.
Yeah. Wow, that was incredible. And I think I'd originally come across the Samothracian inquiry because I was going down a Tartaria rabbit hole. I don't know if you've gone down that hole, but it revolves a lot around analysis of various like architectural structures and kind of looking and speculating a lot about the symbolism and functionality and so on, and mud floods and all kinds of stuff. But so many branches of interesting ideas and thoughts, some really intriguing and plausible, others not so much. But I was looking at the Capitol building here in Arizona, and there's a statue on top of it of this what looks like kind of like an angel, but I looked up what it was, and it was actually modeled after the goddess of the statue that was found on the island. Nike, yes.
Nike, you say in Greek,
yeah. And so that kind of got my interest peaked. But so to close this out, just thank you all so much for listening to this episode of the Aetherica podcast. If you enjoyed this, I please would ask to consider checking out the Patreon at patreon.com/Aetherica. There's always going to be quite a few episodes loaded on there prior to a public release on the RSS, so quite some good value there. Also for myself, if anyone wants more of my other stuff, you can please check out Philosophical Minds podcast. And how about for you, Ike? Where would you like to direct people?
So I'm at youtube.com/@arcanum, ARCANVM, and you can I have my links to my Instagram and email if you want to reach out and contact me there, and I have podcast interviews that I do myself. I've had the honor of having him as a guest, and many other practitioners, academics, researchers, scholars in the fields of the occult, esoteric, and also I give presentation style lectures with a pretty solid production value, I would say. They're a little bit more formal, and they contain show notes and things like that. So you can find the bulk of my content there.
Awesome.